The moment Arthur Hudson rode into Copper Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, 3 different men warned him about Delia Abbott, and not a single one of those warnings made him want to turn his horse around. He had come a long way from Abilene, following a letter from his old friend Jesse Caldwell, who had recently taken over as the sheriff of Copper Creek and needed a deputy he could trust. The town was growing fast, sitting right at the edge of cattle country, with a rail spur being hammered together 3 miles to the east, and land speculators circling like buzzards over a freshly dead carcass. Jesse had written that it was good country with good people mostly, and that there was real opportunity for a man willing to work hard and stay honest. What Jesse had not mentioned, and what Arthur discovered the moment he tied his roan gelding to the post outside the sheriff's office, was Delia Abbott. He heard her before he saw her. A woman's voice, clear and unhesitating as a rifle shot, carried across the main street of Copper Creek with the kind of authority that made men instinctively straighten their spines. "You can tell Mr. Fowler that if he moves that fence line 1 more inch onto my property, I will dismantle it board by board and stack the lumber on his front porch before breakfast." Arthur turned. Standing on the wooden sidewalk across the street was a woman in her late 20s, wearing a worn canvas work coat over a faded blue dress, her dark hair pinned back but escaping in several directions as though it had given up on civilization. She was speaking to a man twice her size with the build of someone who moved other people's fences for a living, and she was not remotely interested in the difference. The large man muttered something. Delia Abbott crossed her arms. "I did not ask what he said." "I told you what I will do. You carry that message back." The large man left. Delia turned and walked into the general store as though nothing of particular significance had just occurred. Jesse Caldwell appeared at Arthur's elbow, having heard the whole exchange from the doorway of the sheriff's office. "Welcome to Copper Creek," Jesse said. "Who is that?" Arthur asked. Jesse picked up a very long breath. "That is Delia Abbott. She runs the Abbott homestead about 4 miles east of town. Her father died 2 winters ago and left the whole operation to her. 120 acres, 20 head of cattle, a well that never runs dry, and a woman who will argue with you about everything from water rights to the proper way to mend a fence post." Jesse paused. "She is also the finest shot in the county, grows the best kitchen garden in the territory, and has kept that ranch running entirely on her own. 2 hands, both of whom would walk through fire for her." "She sounds capable," Arthur said. "She is," Jesse said. "She is also the most opinionated, headstrong, impossible woman I have ever had the pleasure of respecting from a considerable distance." He looked at Arthur with something approaching genuine warning in his eyes. "Every man who has tried to court her has come back looking like he lost an argument with a mountain. She fights on every single thing, every decision, every plan, every suggestion. Some men find it exhausting." Arthur watched the door of the general store where Delia Abbott had disappeared. He could still hear the echo of her voice in his mind, steady and certain and completely unafraid. "That sounds like someone worth listening to," he said. Jesse stared at him. "Lord have mercy," Jesse said quietly. "You are going to be trouble." Arthur smiled for the first time in 3 days of hard riding and went inside to pin on his badge. He did not meet Delia formally until his 2nd week in Copper Creek, and the meeting did not go the way he expected. He had been called out to mediate a dispute over the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town, a dispute that had been going on for the better part of 2 seasons, and had lately developed the potential to become something considerably more serious. On one side was Clayton Fowler, a land speculator from back east, who had purchased several parcels along the creek, with plans to redirect its flow through a system of irrigation channels that would serve a large farming operation he intended to build. On the other side was essentially everyone who had been living along that creek for years, including Delia Abbott, whose property included a 1/4 mile of its banks. Arthur arrived to find a survey crew setting stakes in the ground and Delia Abbott already there, standing in front of one of the stakes with her arms folded and an expression that suggested she had taken root. "Miss Abbott," he said, approaching carefully, "I am Deputy Hudson. I have been sent to keep the peace." "Then tell Mr. Fowler's surveyors to take their stakes and go home," she said without looking away from the crew. "This creek bank is my land. I have the deed. I can recite the boundary descriptions from memory if that would be helpful." "I am sure that will not be necessary," Arthur said. "If you could step back from that stake, I would appreciate it." She turned and looked at him then directly and fully, the way very few people look at a lawman they have just met. Her eyes were dark brown, the color of creek water in shadow, and they did not soften when they assessed him. "Deputy," she said, "I have been stepping back from things my entire life because men have asked me to. I stepped back from my father's business decisions even when I knew they were wrong, and I stepped back when men in this town told me I could not run a ranch alone, and I stepped back last month when a circuit judge told me to settle my water rights claim out of court for a quarter of what the land is worth. I am not stepping back today." Arthur looked at the stake. He looked at her. He looked at the survey crew, who were watching with the hopeful expressions of men who very much wanted someone else to handle this problem. "Do you have your deed with you?" he asked. She reached into the pocket of her coat and produced a folded document. "I always carry it," she said. He took it, unfolded it carefully, and read it. The boundary descriptions were clear. The survey crew's outermost stake was planted approximately 6 feet inside her property line. "Pull that stake," he told the crew foreman. The foreman looked uncertain. "Mr. Fowler said." "Mr. Fowler does not own this land," Arthur said. "Pull the stake." The stake came out. Delia Abbott watched this happen with an expression that did not quite become a smile but moved in that direction. "Thank you, Deputy," she said. She took her deed back and tucked it away. "I would like to request a formal survey from the land office," Arthur said, "to establish the line clearly so this does not happen again. Would you be willing to participate in that process?" "I have been requesting a formal survey for 8 months," she said. "The land office in Santa Fe keeps losing my letters." Arthur pulled out his notebook and wrote that down. "I will write to them directly from the sheriff's office. A letter on official paper tends to get fewer things lost." She looked at him again, that same direct and assessing look. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would tell me to go home and let the men sort it out." "That would be a terrible plan," he said. "You clearly know more about this situation than anyone else involved." She was quiet for a moment, which he suspected was not a state she occupied frequently. "I appreciate that," she said, and she said it simply, without the armor that had been in her voice before. "Most men think a woman who argues is a woman who does not know her place. I think a woman who argues usually knows exactly where her place is," Arthur said, "and is defending it." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was entirely necessary. Then she nodded once, businesslike, and walked back to where her horse was tied. Arthur watched her ride away and wrote 2 more notes in his notebook, neither of which had anything to do with the survey dispute. He wrote the letter to the Santa Fe land office that afternoon. He wrote it a second time when Jesse pointed out a misspelling, and a third time when he decided the second version was not emphatic enough. Jesse watched all of this from across the office with an expression of increasing amusement. "You are writing a land survey request," Jesse said, "not a love letter." "The wording matters," Arthur said. "The wording," Jesse said, "has been revised 4 times. Arthur sealed the third version and set it aside for the Morning Post. "It is official correspondence and it should be correct." "Right," Jesse said. He went back to his own work, but he was smiling at his desk for the better part of an hour. The formal survey came back 6 weeks later, confirming everything Delia's deed had stated. Arthur rode out to the Abbott Ranch to deliver the news personally, which was, he told himself, simply good practice for a deputy who wanted to maintain good relationships with property owners in his jurisdiction. The Abbott homestead was not what he expected, though he was not entirely sure what he had expected. The house was modest, built of adobe and timber, but well-maintained in the way that things are maintained when someone cares about them deeply rather than just for appearances. The kitchen garden Jessie had mentioned was extraordinary, running the full length of the south-facing wall in neat, productive rows. The stock fence was tightly strung. The barn was clean. One of the hands, an older man named Horace who had worked the land since before Delia's father had bought it, directed Arthur to the north pasture where Delia was working. He found her mending a section of fence line, working alone and working efficiently, driving a staple with practiced force. "Miss Abbott," he called. She turned. She was wearing the same canvas coat, which seemed to be a permanent feature of her wardrobe, and her hair was doing its customary rebellion against its pins. She looked, Arthur thought, entirely at home in this landscape in a way that some people spend their entire lives searching for. "Deputy Hudson," she said, "what brings you all the way out here?" He dismounted and walked to where she stood. He handed her the survey document. "The results came back. The boundary is confirmed as you stated. I have also sent a copy to Fowler's attorney with a formal notice that any further encroachment will be treated as a legal matter." She took the document and read it. He watched her face as she read, the way careful attention moved through her expression. "This is very thorough," she said. "I asked them to include a detailed map," he said. "I thought it would be harder to misread." She looked up from the paper. "You are very thorough, Deputy Hudson." "Arthur," he said, "if that is acceptable, we are not in the office." Something shifted very slightly in her expression. "Delia," she said, "since we are not in the office." They stood there in the north pasture of the Abbott Ranch with the New Mexico afternoon light going gold around them, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark making a fine argument for the quality of the day. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "Horace always makes too much." "I would like that very much," he said. They drank coffee on the porch, and Delia talked about the ranch with the thoroughness and passion of someone who had been waiting for a listener who would not get impatient. She talked about the water management system her father had built and the improvements she had made to it. She talked about the cattle breeding decisions she had made over the last 2 years and why she had made them. She talked about her plan to expand the garden and sell produce to the rail camp that was being established to the east, which she had already discussed with the camp foreman and had received a preliminary agreement for. Arthur listened. He asked questions, real questions, not the kind that men sometimes ask women to appear interested while they wait for the conversation to redirect toward something they consider more important. He asked about the water system because it was genuinely interesting. He asked about the cattle because he knew something about cattle, and the decisions she described were sound, and he wanted to understand her reasoning. After an hour, Delia looked at him with a slightly puzzled expression. "You are still here," she said. "The coffee is good," he said. "Most men stop listening after about 10 minutes of ranch talk." "Most men," Arthur said, "are missing out." She looked at him with that assessing look again, but there was something warmer in it now, something that was beginning to let its guard down around the edges. "I should get back to that fence line," she said. "And I should get back to town," he said. He stood, set his coffee cup down carefully, and picked up his hat. "Thank you for the coffee, Delia." "Thank you for the survey," she said. He rode back toward town in the long afternoon light and thought about the way she said his name when she first used it, matter of fact and direct, the same way she said everything, without decoration or coyness. He decided it was one of the finest things he had heard in a long time. He came back to the ranch 12 days later on legitimate business, because there was a matter of a stray calf that had wandered onto Abbott land and needed to be identified and returned to its proper owner, and this required him to look at the calf personally, which meant riding out to the Abbott ranch. Delia greeted him at the gate with an expression that suggested she found the formality of the calf situation somewhat amusing. "It is a Hereford cross," she said, "about 8 months old. Ear notch suggests it belongs to the Peterson spread north of town." "You already identified it," he said. "Yesterday," she said. "I sent word to the Petersons. They are coming for it Thursday." That was efficient, he said. I'm a very efficient person, she said. She was looking at him with the corners of her mouth doing something complicated. Was the calf the only reason you came out? Arthur had not survived this long in the West by being unable to read a situation. No, he said. Good, she said. The coffee is ready. They had coffee again, and this time they stayed on the porch longer, and the conversation wandered away from ranch business into other territory. He told her about Abilene, and the cattle drives he had worked before Jesse's letter had brought him south. She told him about growing up on this land, about her father's stories of coming west from Ohio when she was 6 years old, and the years of building something out of nothing in a country that did not make it easy. He was a difficult man in some ways, she said, looking out at the land. He believed in what he was building here, but he never quite believed I could build it after him. He left it to me because there was no one else, but he left instructions with the lawyer about hiring a man to manage it. She said this without anger but with a very precise kind of sadness. I did not follow those instructions. Did you tell the lawyer that? I told him at some length, she said, and the sadness gave way to something more like wry amusement. He was not pleased. And here the ranch stands, Arthur said. Here the ranch stands, she agreed. He looked at her profile against the afternoon sky, the strong line of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes, and he thought that he had never met anyone quite like her, and that this was not a small thing. He came back a third time without any excuse at all. Simply rode out on a Sunday afternoon and arrived at the gate and found her in the garden. And when she looked up and saw him, she did not look surprised. She looked, he thought, like someone who had been wondering when he was going to stop inventing reasons. No calf this time, she said. No calf, he said. I came to see you. She stood up from the garden row, brushing soil from her hands. That is honest, she said. I am trying to be, he said. She studied him for a long moment. The garden smelled of turned earth and growing things, and the afternoon was the kind of quiet that only happens in open country, a quiet that has size and depth to it. Come help me with this row, she said. If you are going to be here, you might as well be useful. He tied his horse and rolled up his sleeves and spent the next hour on his knees in the kitchen garden, learning from Delia Abbott the particular requirements of tomato plants in high desert soil, which, she informed him with complete authority, were entirely different from what he would have encountered in Kansas. He argued with her about the spacing on general principle. She gave him 4 completely specific reasons why she was right. He listened to all 4 reasons and conceded the point, and she seemed slightly surprised that he had. Most people argue with me just to argue, she said. I argue when I think I have something worth arguing, he said. You are right, I would rather learn something. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. The late sun was directly behind him and she had to shade her eyes. Arthur Hudson, she said, you are a genuinely strange man. Is that a problem, he said. No, she said. It is not a problem at all. They finished the garden row and washed their hands at the pump and sat on the porch again, and this time the conversation was easier, flowing with the naturalness of people who have found each other's frequency. They talked about the territory, about what it was becoming, about the railroad that was going to change everything within 50 miles of the new spur. Arthur told her that he thought the changes were coming whether people wanted them or not, and the only real question was whether the people who had built this country would have any say in how it changed. That is why I fight for the survey lines, she said. It is not about stubbornness. It is about being here when the changes come. I know, he said. I understood that the first time I saw you standing in front of that stake. She looked at him quietly for a moment. The evening was coming on, turning the sky over the mesa the color of embers. You should come to supper, she said. Horace has made an elk stew and he always makes too much of that too. Horace seems to cook in very generous quantities, Arthur said. He is convinced I do not eat enough, she said. He is probably right. He stayed for supper and ate elk stew and talked with Horace and with the other hand, a younger man named Tomás, who had grown up on a rancho south of Santa Fe and had a gift for fixing mechanical things that Delia relied on extensively. The table was easy and warm, and Arthur noticed the way Delia managed the household, not with the rigid authority of someone asserting their position, but with the natural ease of someone who understood what everyone needed and provided it without making it into a demonstration. When he finally rode back toward town in the dark, the stars over New Mexico enormous and unhurried above him, he thought about the way she had looked when she said his name, and about the way she had laughed at one of his stories about a particularly obstinate mule in Abilene, a laugh that was bright and unguarded and completely real. He thought about it for most of the ride home and for a considerable portion of the night afterward. Clayton Fowler did not give up easily, which Arthur had expected from the first moment he pulled that survey stake out of the ground. Men who moved from back east with money and plans generally did not consider the word no to be a final answer, particularly when the no was coming from a woman alone on a ranch in the New Mexico territory. Fowler's next move was to approach the county commissioners about a proposed road expansion that, by remarkable coincidence, would require an easement across the southeastern corner of the Abbott property. The easement, if granted, would effectively give Fowler access to the section of creek bank that he wanted without having to dispute the deed directly. Delia found out about the proposal 3 days before the commissioners' meeting, which gave her 3 days to prepare a counterargument that Arthur suspected would be thorough. He was correct. He rode out to the Abbott ranch the evening before the meeting to brief her on the procedural aspects, since he had more experience with the legal mechanisms of these processes than she did, and found her at the kitchen table with every document she owned spread out before her, organized into categories he could not immediately identify, but which she clearly understood completely. "I know about the easement request," she said before he could speak. "I found out from Tomaz, who heard it from the livery man, who heard it from one of the commissioners' wives. I have been preparing since this morning. I came to tell you about the procedural rules for the meeting," he said. "Citizens can address the commissioners during the public comment period, but there are time limits and you need to state your objections formally for the record." She nodded and wrote something down. "How long is the comment period?" 5 minutes per speaker, but if you submit written objections in advance, those go into the formal record regardless of the time limit." She looked up. "Can you help me draft the written objection tonight?" "That is why I am here," he said. They worked at the kitchen table for 2 hours, with Horace bringing coffee at intervals and Tomaz occasionally appearing in the doorway to offer opinions that Delia incorporated or dismissed with equal efficiency. Arthur knew the legal language required. Delia knew every fact about her land and every precedent she could cite from neighboring property disputes. Together, they produced a document that Arthur thought was considerably better than either of them could have produced alone. "This is good," she said, reading the final version. "Your knowledge of the boundary history is exceptional," he said. "I would not have known half of these precedents." "My father kept meticulous records," she said. "I have kept better ones." She looked up from the document and found him watching her with an expression he had not entirely tried to conceal. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment, deciding something. "About how much I enjoy being in this room," he said, "working on this with you." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp on the table burned steadily. Outside, a coyote made a brief remark about the night and fell silent again. Delia looked at him for a long moment with that assessing look, but the assessment had changed. It was less guarded now, less careful. "I enjoy it too," she said, simply and without decoration. He rode home again in the dark, and this time he was smiling most of the way. The commissioners' meeting was held in the town hall, a building that served also as the church on Sundays and the schoolroom on weekdays, and therefore smelled permanently of chalk, hymn books, and community disagreement. It was well attended, because Copper Creek was the kind of town that paid attention to decisions about land and water, and because word had gotten around that Delia Abbott was going to speak, which was generally considered worth showing up for. Clayton Fowler sat in the front row with his attorney, a man from Santa Fe named Graves who wore a suit that cost more than most people in the room made in a month. Fowler was a heavy-set man in his 40s, not unpleasant-looking, but with the quality of someone who had always found that money solved most problems and was mildly surprised when it did not. Arthur stood at the back of the room. He was not there in an official capacity. The meeting was a civil matter, not a law enforcement one. He was there because Delia would not have asked him to be, and therefore he wanted to be. When Delia's turn came to speak, she stood at the front of the room with the written objection in one hand and her own notes in the other, and she addressed the three commissioners with the complete composure of someone who had spent weeks being right about something. She described the history of her property. She described the existing easements and why they were sufficient for any legitimate road expansion. She described the specific section of creek bank that the proposed easement would affect, and why it was critical to her water access. She described with careful precision why the proposed road route was peculiarly and specifically convenient for Clayton Fowler's planned irrigation project, in a way that made it clear she did not think this was a coincidence. "I am not opposed to roads," she said. "Roads benefit everyone in this valley. I am opposed to road proposals that benefit one specific private land speculator and are presented to this commission as public necessity." She paused. "I have submitted written documentation of all these points for the record. I would ask the commissioners to examine that documentation carefully before voting." She sat down. There was a moment of silence, and then a murmur of voices, and Arthur could see from the back of the room that at least two of the three commissioners were looking at the written documentation with expressions of people who had not expected it to be quite so thorough. Fowler's attorney spoke for 10 minutes using a great many words that amounted to considerably less content than Delia had produced in 5. The commissioners voted to table the easement proposal pending further review. This was not a victory exactly, but it was not a defeat either, and it meant Fowler would have to try a different approach. Afterward, in the street outside the town hall, Jessie clapped Arthur on the shoulder. "She is something," Jessie said. "Yes," Arthur said, watching Delia speak with two of the neighboring landowners who had come up to congratulate her. "She is." "You have got it bad," Jessie said. "I have not said anything," Arthur said. "You have not stopped looking at her for 2 hours," Jessie said. "You do not need to say anything." Arthur took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "She is not going to make it easy." "No," Jessie said. "She absolutely is not. That is generally considered to be a problem." "I do not think it is a problem," Arthur said. Jessie looked at him and shook his head with the fond exasperation of a man watching a friend walk calmly into a river. "You know," he said, "I believe you actually mean that." Delia came toward them then, and she was carrying herself with the particular straightness of someone who has just done something they were right to do, and her eyes were bright, and when she saw Arthur at Jessie's shoulder her expression did something that he thought about for a long time afterward. "That went well," she said. "You were exceptional," Arthur said, and he said it directly, without qualification. She looked at him, and the brightness in her eyes shifted slightly into something more personal and more careful. "Thank you for helping with the written objection," she said. "It made a difference." "You would have managed without me," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but I was glad you were here." The April evening had the particular clarity that comes to the New Mexico high desert after a cold winter, the air fine and the stars beginning to show at the edges of the sky. Delia looked up for a moment, and in the streetlight from the town hall her face was very clear, and Arthur thought that he was running out of reasons to be careful about the things he was feeling. He was not a man who moved quickly. He had lived 29 years in a country that did not reward impatience, and he had learned to read the land and the weather and the hearts of the people around him with the same patience he applied to everything else. But he had also lived long enough to know that some things did not improve with indefinite waiting. "Delia," he said. Jessie excused himself with the discreet efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Yes," she said. "I would like to take you to supper," he said. "Not at your ranch, where Horace will be there, and not incidentally while I am delivering survey documents. Just supper, in town, because I would like to spend the evening with you." She looked at him for a long moment. The careful assessment was there, but underneath it was something else, something that had been building since the day in the north pasture with the survey document, or perhaps since the day with the fence stake, and it was not reluctance. "All right," she said. "Friday evening." "Friday evening," he said. He put his hat back on and walked away with the measured step of a man who is working very hard not to let on how pleased he is. And behind him, he heard her say something quietly to herself that might have been a laugh. Friday evening supper at the Blue Lantern, which was Copper Creek's only establishment that served proper sit-down meals and not just a bar with food nearby, was everything Arthur had hoped it would be, and also exactly as complicated as he had expected. They argued about the territorial legislature's recent land policy revisions, and Delia was right about most of it, and Arthur conceded gracefully. They argued about the best route for the eventual road expansion that the county commissioners genuinely did need to pursue, and Arthur was right about the engineering considerations, and Delia conceded that point with the same directness she brought to everything else. No wounded pride, no drawing back, just a clean acknowledgement followed by building on the new information. Between the arguments they talked about smaller things. She told him about a book she was reading, a novel that had arrived in the last mail shipment, and her opinions about it were precise and deeply felt. He told her about his family in Missouri, his mother who kept a garden like Delia's, and his father who had driven cattle until his knees gave out and who now spent his days making furniture he gave away to neighbors. "You miss them," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I am not unhappy here." She looked at him. "No," she said, "you do not seem unhappy here." By the time the meal was finished and the coffee was on the table, the conversation had slowed into the particular warmth of people who have found that they do not need to fill all the silence, who are comfortable simply being in the same room. "I have not had an evening like this in a long time," she said. "What kind of evening?" he said. "One where I felt entirely myself," she said. "Where I did not feel like I needed to be smaller or quieter or more agreeable than I am." Arthur looked across the table at her, at this woman who had fought for her land and her voice and her right to be exactly the complicated and capable person she was, and he felt something in him settle into certainty the way a foundation stone settles into good ground. "I do not want you smaller or quieter or more agreeable," he said. "I want exactly you as you are." She held his gaze, and something in her expression opened, some last careful guard standing down. "That is an extraordinary thing to say," she said quietly. "It is an entirely true thing to say," he said. They walked out into the Copper Creek night together, and the air was cool and the stars were immense, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked down the main street of town in the easy quiet of people who have found something real. At the hitching post where her horse was tied, she turned and looked at him with a directness that was entirely her own. "I will tell you something, Arthur Hudson," she said. "I have spent 5 years since my father died being entirely self-sufficient, and I have been proud of that, and I am still proud of that. But I have also been lonely. Not always and not terribly, but honestly." "I know something about that," he said. "I believe you do," she said. "I just want you to know that when I argue with you about things, it is not because I do not trust you. It is because I have learned that the best way to make good decisions is to examine them from every angle." "I know that too," he said. "It is one of the things I admire most about you." She was very close to him in the night air. The lamplight from the Blue Lantern made warm shapes on the street. "Good," she said. And then, with the same directness she applied to everything else in her life, she stood up on the step of the hitching post rail, which brought her almost level with him, and kissed him once, briefly and intentionally, and stepped back. "Good night, Arthur," she said. He stood there for a moment. "Good night, Delia," he managed. She swung up onto her horse with the practiced ease of a woman who had been riding since childhood, and walked the horse down the street without looking back. and Arthur watched her go and thought that he was, without question, thoroughly lost. Clayton Fowler's next move came 6 weeks later in June, when the rail spur reached its completion, and suddenly the land east of Copper Creek became considerably more valuable overnight. Arthur had been keeping an eye on Fowler's activities, because men who do not accept no have a habit of eventually trying something more direct. What Fowler tried was hiring 2 men, who were not surveyors, to ride out to the Abbott property after dark and remove a section of the legitimate fence line along the creek bank, which would have allowed Fowler's cattle to access the water freely and established, over time, a de facto easement through usage. Horace discovered them at 3 in the morning and woke Delia, who appeared with a rifle and the kind of composure that comes from being raised on land where coyotes and worse things sometimes required attention in the night. She did not fire the rifle. She simply made it clear that she had it and knew how to use it, and the 2 men decided their wages from Fowler were not adequate compensation for the current situation and left. By first light she had sent Tamaz into town to tell Arthur. Arthur found Fowler at the hotel, at breakfast, and had a very direct conversation with him that Arthur kept entirely within the boundaries of what was legal and appropriate, but which left Fowler in no doubt about the consequences of a third incident. He also filed a formal incident report and sent a copy to Fowler's attorney. He then rode out to the Abbott ranch. Delia was at the repaired fence, which she and Horace had already fixed by the time Arthur arrived. She looked at him when he rode up and her expression was controlled, but underneath it he could see that she was shaken, not frightened precisely, but affected in the way that a person is affected when they realize that someone is willing to act against them in the dark. He dismounted and stood beside her at the fence, and for a moment they were both quiet. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. Then, after a moment, "No, not entirely. Not yet." "That is a reasonable way to feel," he said. "I handled it," she said, and there was something in her voice that was working hard. "You handled it exactly right," he said. "That is not the part I am asking about." She turned and looked at him, and for just a moment the composure slipped, and he saw the exhaustion behind it, the accumulated weight of 5 years of handling everything alone, of every fight for every inch of ground, of knowing that the next thing was always coming. "I am tired," she said quietly. "Not of the ranch, not of the land. I love this land more than I can tell you, but I am tired of doing it completely alone." Arthur had been carrying something for the last 6 weeks that he had been keeping careful and patient about, and he looked at this woman in the morning light of the New Mexico summer, and the patience had run its full course. "Delia," he said. "Yes." "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been trying to be sensible about it, but I do not have any more sensible left. I am completely in love with you, and I want to spend my life helping you fight every battle that comes at this land, and making sure you never have to be tired and alone at the same time." She stared at him. The morning was very bright, and the fence line stretched away in both directions, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek a bird was carrying on enthusiastically. "That was direct," she said. "You respect directness," he said. "I do," she said. She was looking at him with the most unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face, stripped of the careful assessment and the armor and everything else, just Delia Abbott in the morning sun next to a fence she had repaired herself at dawn after a sleepless night, looking at him. "I love you too," she said. "I have been working very hard at being reasonable about it." He laughed, which surprised both of them. She laughed too, and the laughter was the bright, unguarded kind. And then he reached out, and she reached out, and they found each other in the middle, and he held her for a long moment in the morning warmth of the June pasture. "We are going to argue," she said, her voice muffled slightly against his shoulder. "About everything," he agreed. "And you genuinely do not mind that," she said. "It was not quite a question. I told Jesse Caldwell on my first day in Copper Creek that someone who fights on every decision sounded like someone worth listening to," he said. "I meant it then, and I mean it considerably more now." She pulled back and looked at him. "Jesse told you about me before you ever met me." "He warned me," Arthur said. "It did not have the intended effect." She studied him with the corners of her mouth doing the complicated thing. What exactly did he say? That you were opinionated and headstrong and impossible, Arthur said, and the finest shot in the county and the best kitchen gardener in the territory. And you decided that sounded appealing. I decided that sounded like someone with genuine convictions and genuine skills, Arthur said, which is considerably rarer than people seem to think. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. No one has ever seen it that way, she said. Not the way you do. Then they were not paying attention, he said. She reached up and put her hand against his face, the same capable hand that had driven fence staples and worked a rifle and tended a kitchen garden and written legal objections, and she looked at him with the full weight of everything she was. "Marry me," she said. He blinked. "I was going to ask you," he said. "You were taking too long," she said. He laughed again and took her hand from his face and held it. "Yes," he said. "Obviously yes, without any hesitation." "Good," she said. "I thought so. But I wanted to make sure." They stood at the fence in the morning sun for a long time, in the way that people stand when they have found something they did not know they had been looking for. And the land lay open around them in every direction, patient and enormous and full of the kind of beauty that asks nothing of you except that you pay attention to it. The wedding was held in September, when the heat had broken, and the New Mexico autumn was coming on in shades of copper and gold. A ceremony that Delia planned with the same efficiency she applied to everything else, and Arthur contributed to primarily by ensuring that Jesse managed to procure the judge who was passing through on circuit, and by finding, somewhere in his saddlebags, his grandfather's pocket watch to give her as a wedding gift. She gave him a silver concho bracelet that Tomás had made from a piece of silver he had been saving, hammered with a pattern of desert flowers, which Arthur wore for the rest of his life. The ceremony was held outside, because Delia said she had spent enough of her life indoors arguing for things, and she wanted to get married with the sky overhead, and no one disagreed with her, partly because no one ever successfully disagreed with Delia about things she had decided, and partly because it was a fine idea. Jesse stood up with Arthur. Horace walked Delia to the makeshift altar, which was a flat-topped rock that had always stood at the center of the ranch yard, and which Horace had decorated with dried flowers and a piece of the good cloth from town. And he was not quite crying, but his face was doing something that required considerable management. The judge was brief and the vows were traditional, but when it came time for the traditional phrasing about obeying, Delia looked at the judge with a pleasant expression and he wisely moved to the next line. Arthur said his vows looking at her directly, in the same way he had said everything to her since the beginning, without qualification or performance. She said hers back to him in the same way, clear and certain, and entirely herself. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the judge said, and there was a cheer from the assembled population of people who had come from town and from neighboring ranches, including, Arthur noticed, 2 of the 3 county commissioners and, somewhat to his surprise, the foreman of the survey crew who had pulled the stake back in April, who appeared to bear no grudge and who had brought a very good bottle of whiskey as a gift. That evening, sitting on the porch of the ranch house that was now his home too, the party moving through the yard around them with music from a fiddle someone had produced, and the smell of wood smoke and good food, Arthur sat beside Delia and she leaned against him in the way that people lean when they have decided someone is solid ground. "I have something to tell you," she said. "What is it?" he said. "I had Graves, Fowler's attorney, send me his client's latest land valuation documents this week," she said. "Through the formal property records request process, I have been tracking Fowler's financial position." Arthur looked at her. "Tell me." "He is overextended," she said. "He borrowed heavily on the rail spur speculation and the spur has underperformed its projections by about 30%. He is going to have to sell at least 2 of his parcels by spring." "And you think he might try something before then?" Arthur said. "I think a desperate man with a lawyer is more dangerous than a confident one," she said. "I want to be prepared." He thought about this for a moment. "What do you want to do?" I want to approach one of the other landowners he owes, the Garcias, who have the parcel on the north side of the creek. If we can work out a cooperative arrangement with them for water access, it takes away Fowler's strongest leverage entirely." "That is a smart move," Arthur said. "I know," she said. "I want your opinion on the terms." He looked at her, this woman who had asked for his opinion as a matter of course, not because she needed his permission, but because she valued the combination of what they brought together. "Tell me what you are thinking," he said, and she told him, precisely and in detail, and he listened and asked questions and twice pointed to considerations she had not factored in, and once she pointed out a flaw in his reasoning. And by the time the fiddle had played 3 songs, they had outlined an approach that was better than either of them would have arrived at alone. "That is what I wanted," she said. "To plan land strategy at our wedding party," he said. "To think with someone," she said simply. "To not have to do it all inside my own head." He put his arm around her and felt her settle against him. "You never have to do that alone again," he said. "I know," she said. And she said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had examined the evidence carefully and reached a conclusion she was prepared to stand behind. The winter that followed was the first winter Delia had not spent alone in the ranch house, and Arthur discovered things about her in the close quarters of the cold months that the warmer seasons had not yet shown him. He discovered that she woke before dawn every morning with the automatic alertness of someone who had spent years being the first one up and the last one to bed. He discovered that she kept a journal, had kept one since she was 12 years old, in a series of small notebooks that lived on the shelf above the kitchen table. He discovered that she had an extraordinary singing voice that she had apparently kept entirely to herself, until the evening in January when she did not notice him in the doorway, and he heard her singing quietly to herself while she worked at the stove. She stopped when she heard him and turned with a look that was, for just a moment, genuinely embarrassed. "That was beautiful," he said. "Do not make a production of it," she said. "I am not making a production of it," he said. "I am telling you the truth." She turned back to the stove. "My mother sang," she said after a moment. "She had a real voice. I have only the habit of it." "I liked what I heard," he said. She did not respond to that directly, but that evening after supper, without announcement, she sang 2 songs while the lamp burned low, and Arthur sat across the table and listened. And this became a thing they did in the evenings of that winter, an ordinary and private happiness that belonged entirely to them. In February, Delia confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks. She told Arthur at breakfast, directly, in the way she told him everything. "I am expecting," she said. "I believe it will be late summer or early fall." He put down his coffee cup and looked at her. She was watching him with the careful assessment that she brought to things that mattered, ready to manage whatever response came. What came was that he stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, with a thoroughness and tenderness that made the careful assessment entirely unnecessary. "Are you pleased?" she said. "Beyond any reasonable description," he said. "Good," she said. "Because I need to rearrange the north bedroom and I want to discuss with you whether we should hire an additional hand for the summer since I will be less useful for several months." "You will not be less useful," he said. "You will be somewhat differently occupied." "I am not planning on being incapacitated, Arthur. I intend to keep working until the baby tells me otherwise." "I know you do," he said. "I would never suggest otherwise. I am simply saying that we should hire a hand because we need one for the summer regardless, and the timing is fortunate." She considered this. "That is a reasonable position," she said. "I have them occasionally," he said. She reached up and covered one of his hands with hers. Her expression was softer than her words, the way it always was when the words were practical and the heart was doing something else entirely. "I am glad," she said quietly, "about this. About all of it." "So am I," he said, "more than I know how to say." The matter of Clayton Fowler resolved itself in March in a way that was satisfying in its cleanness. The Garcia family, having heard through Tomás's extensive network of people who knew people that the Hudsons were interested in a cooperative water arrangement, approached them first. The arrangement they worked out gave both families secure access to the creek regardless of what happened to the land parcels between them. Fowler's attorney contacted Arthur in his official capacity in April, inquiring about the possibility of a negotiated settlement of all outstanding disputes. Arthur consulted Delia thoroughly. Delia proposed terms. The terms were accepted, largely because Fowler was in the position she had predicted and had no remaining leverage, and by May the matter was formally concluded. "He will sell the parcels and leave," Delia said, reading the settlement documentation at the kitchen table. "The rail camp workers are looking for land. 2 of them have already asked Horace about the irrigation capacity of the creek." "New neighbors," Arthur said. "Hardworking ones, I expect," she said. "Men who go west to work the rail generally know how to work." "Do you want to approach them?" he said. "I already have," she said, looking up with a slight smile. "I had coffee with the camp foreman last Tuesday and gave him the names of the 2 best land agents in the territory, the honest ones." Arthur looked at her. "You did that while I was in Santa Fe at the courthouse. You were busy with the property lien matter," she said. "I was not." He shook his head slowly, but he was smiling. "Is there anything you do not handle 3 steps ahead of when it becomes necessary?" "Plenty of things," she said. "I'm still not certain about the North Pasture rotation for next season. I've been going back and forth on it." "Tell me," he said, and she did, and they worked it out together at the kitchen table while the spring afternoon light moved through the windows and the land outside was green in the way the desert goes briefly and brilliantly green in the weeks after the winter rains. Their son was born on a September morning, a clear and windless dawn with the smell of the turning season in the air, delivered by the doctor who had ridden out from town and by Horace's wife, Maria, who had come for the last week, and who turned out to be exactly the person you wanted in that situation. He was a healthy and opinionated child who declared his arrival at considerable volume. They named him James, after Arthur's father, with Edward as a middle name, after Delia's father, who had been difficult in some ways but who had built this land and loved it and left it to her. Delia held the baby in the afternoon light of the bedroom and Arthur sat beside her, and outside the window the Abbott land stretched away in every direction under the enormous New Mexico sky, 120 acres of high desert that had been fought for and tended and loved into something that would outlast all of them. "Hello, James," Delia said to the baby, in the quiet voice she used for things that mattered most. "This is your land. We will show you every inch of it." James expressed an opinion about this that was nonspecific but enthusiastic. "He is already arguing," Arthur said. "Of course he is," Delia said. "He has my blood." Arthur looked at his wife and his son in the September light, and thought that he had come a long way from Abilene following a letter about a sheriff's position, and had arrived, by a set of circumstances that felt, from this side of them, entirely inevitable, at exactly where he was supposed to be. In the 3 years that followed, the Abbott Ranch became the Hudson Ranch in name only on the county records, because Delia kept calling it the Abbott land and always would, and everyone in Copper Creek understood this and did not try to correct it. The operation grew steadily. The vegetable business with the rail camp became a proper arrangement with the new farming settlement that grew up around it, and by 1885 Delia was running a modest but genuine commercial kitchen garden operation that supplied 3 settlements and made enough money to fund the expansion of the cattle herd to 60 head. Arthur was promoted to sheriff when Jesse Caldwell announced his intention to retire to a small spread south of town that he had purchased with the accumulated savings of 15 years of law enforcement. The promotion came with more work and more responsibility, but it also gave Arthur a broader platform for the kind of land and water rights advocacy that he had been doing quietly since his first week in Copper Creek. He became known, over those years, as a sheriff who listened carefully and decided slowly, and was very difficult to move once he had decided, which was a reputation that suited the territory well. Delia became known as the person to talk to if you had a land dispute in the eastern part of the county, which she had not planned but which suited her perfectly, since it meant she was continuously at the center of the decisions that shaped the valley she lived in. They argued about everything still. They argued about the cattle rotation, about water management, about the timing of the kitchen garden expansion, about the best approach to the county commission on the new road proposal that came up in 1884, about whether to hire a third permanent hand or a seasonal one, about the best way to approach the new land agent who had set up in Copper Creek, and whose practices seemed to Delia to be considerably below the ethical standards she expected. Every argument was a real one. No ground was conceded that did not deserve to be conceded, and no decision was made that had not been examined from every possible angle, and the decisions they reached together were consistently better than the ones either of them would have reached alone, and they both knew it, and this knowledge was one of the foundations of everything they had built. James turned 3 in the fall of 1885, which meant that he was old enough to follow his mother around the kitchen garden with the focused determination of a small person who intends to understand everything, and old enough to sit on the fence rail with his father in the evenings when the cattle were being moved and watch the operation with the wide, attentive eyes of someone taking thorough notes. He had Delia's dark eyes and her quality of absolute directness and Arthur's patience, which was a formidable combination that Horace predicted, with considerable delight, was going to be spectacular trouble by the time the boy was 10. On the evening of the 3rd anniversary of their wedding, Arthur and Delia sat on the porch of the ranch house in the September dark, with James asleep inside and the stars overhead in their full September density, and the land spread out around them in the way that land does in the dark, not invisible but present, sensed more than seen. "I have been thinking," Delia said. "Tell me," he said, "about the parcel south of the creek, the one the Garcia family is considering selling." "I think we should consider buying it." Arthur looked at the dark shape of the southern land. "That is 200 acres if they sell the whole parcel. It would give us the full run of the creek," she said. "And the south grazing land would allow us to double the herd by 1888. "That is a very large financial commitment," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been working out the numbers. I want to show them to you." She reached into her pocket and produced a folded paper which she had clearly prepared before this conversation, which meant she had known she would raise it tonight. He took the paper and looked at it in the moonlight, which was just bright enough for reading. The numbers were thorough, with 3 different scenarios for repayment under different cattle price conditions. "You did this yourself," he said. "This afternoon while you were in town," she said. "I wanted to have something concrete to discuss." He looked at the paper and then at her and felt the particular warmth that came, still, every time she did something that was entirely, completely, recognizably herself. "The middle scenario is the most realistic," he said. "But there is a 4th scenario you have not accounted for, which is that the Garcia family might be willing to take a partial stake in the herd as part of the purchase price, which would reduce our cash exposure." She was quiet for a moment. "I had not thought of that," she said. "Your brother-in-law mentioned last month that the Garcias were interested in cattle but did not have the acreage for a herd," Arthur said. "I filed it away." "That is very useful," she said. "If it worked, we could manage the purchase entirely without borrowing." "That was my thought," he said. She took the paper back and looked at it, and he could see her mind working, the fast and thorough engine of it incorporating the new variable. "This could work," she said. "I think it could," he said. She folded the paper back up and put it in her pocket and leaned against his shoulder in the September dark. "I love you," she said. "You know that, but I want to say it specifically." "I know it," he said. "I love you too, specifically and completely." They sat in the quiet for a while, and the land around them was full of the nighttime sounds of a living landscape, the insects and the distant creek, and somewhere in the eastern distance, the faint sound of the rail that had changed this valley and was changing it still. "Arthur," she said. "Yes." "About the south parcel," she said. "I want to approach the Garcias before we discuss it further with anyone else. I want to go to them directly before word gets around that they are selling." "Of course," he said. "When do you want to go?" "Thursday morning," she said. "I will make the approach. You should come as the sheriff in case there are any title questions, but I will do the talking." He smiled into the dark. "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise," he said. "Good," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. The approach to the Garcias on Thursday morning went well, as most things went when Delia had prepared them, which was thoroughly and in advance. The Garcia family patriarch, a man named Roberto Garcia, who had been in the valley for 20 years and had more wisdom about the land than most people had about anything, listened to Delia's proposal with the careful attention of someone who recognized careful preparation when he encountered it. He agreed in principle to the partial stake arrangement before the morning was out. His wife brought out coffee and sweet bread, and they sat at the Garcia table working through the specifics with the particular ease of people who respect each other and are not in a hurry to make the other party feel foolish. By noon they had the outline of an agreement. By the following week, with Arthur's help in drafting the formal documents, they had a full contract. The land closed in October, 3 weeks before Delia told Arthur that James was going to have a sibling. She told him at breakfast again, the same way she had told him the first time, directly and clearly over coffee. "Again in late summer, I think," she said. He came around the table the same way he had come around it 3 years ago and held her face in his hands and kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth. "You are consistent," she said. "I hope so," he said. "I intend to be." The spring of 1886 brought changes to Copper Creek that would not have surprised anyone who had been watching the territory's development closely, and Delia had been watching it closely, so she was prepared. The railroad's influence had brought enough new residents to justify a proper school, which had been a project Delia had been advocating for with the county for 2 years, and which was finally funded in April. She had written 4 letters to the county commissioners about it and had appeared at 3 meetings and had brought a petition signed by every family with school-age children in the eastern part of the county. The school opened in the fall, a small adobe building with a teacher from Denver named Miss Harding, who was young and serious and intimidated by precisely nothing, and who reminded Arthur so strongly of Delia at their first meeting that he had to work to keep a straight face. He told Delia this on the ride home from the school opening. She considered it for a moment. "I will take that as a compliment," she said. "It was entirely intended as one," he said. Their daughter was born in August of 1886, on a morning that was hot even by New Mexico August standards, delivered again by the doctor and Maria, with James asleep in the next room through the entire proceeding and waking only at the moment of his sister's arrival, as though he had been informed. They named her Clara. She had Arthur's coloring and Delia's eyes, and from the first hours of her life, an expression of focused inquiry that Horace said was going to be magnificent trouble, which he seemed to find even more delightful the second time. James met his sister with the grave seriousness of a 3-year-old confronted with something new and requiring evaluation. "She is small," he said. "She will not always be," Delia said. James considered this. "Does she argue?" he asked. Arthur pressed his mouth into a very firm line. "She will learn," Delia said. "Good," James said, satisfied, and went back to examining the situation from multiple angles. By 1887, the Hudson Ranch, which Delia still called the Abbott land to Arthur's permanent and affectionate amusement, encompassed 320 acres along the best creek access in the eastern valley, ran a herd of 110 cattle, operated a commercial kitchen garden that supplied 4 settlements, and had built, on the original foundation of the modest adobe house, a proper family home with a covered porch that ran the full length of the south face. Horace had a cottage adjacent to the main house now. Tomás had married the Garcia daughter, a quiet and determined young woman named Rosa, who turned out to have a gift for the cattle operation that rivaled Delia's, and they had their own small house on the northeastern corner of the property. It had become the kind of place where things were done well, and the people who did them were valued, and this did not happen by accident. Arthur was still the sheriff of Copper Creek, going into his 6th year, and the territory had changed considerably in those 6 years. The Apache conflicts that had torn through the southern part of the territory were concluding, though not in a way that Arthur thought about without a heavy conscience, knowing as he did the injustice being done to people who had lived on this land far longer than any of the settlers he served. He had said as much more than once to the federal agents who passed through his jurisdiction, and Delia had said it alongside him with considerably more force, and while saying it changed less than it should have, they both believed the saying of it mattered. The law was imperfect and the territory was imperfect, and the world they were building was shot through with injustices, large and small, that no amount of water rights disputes or school petitions could fully address. They talked about this, at the kitchen table and on the porch, and in the way that married people talk about the things that weigh on them, not always with resolution but always with honesty. "We do what we can from where we stand," Delia said once, on an evening when Arthur had come home troubled from a conversation with a federal marshal about the relocation orders being enforced in the South. "It does not feel like enough," he said. "It almost never is," she said. "But the alternative is to stop, and that does not help anyone." He looked at her across the supper table, this woman who fought for every inch and never pretended the fighting was sufficient but never stopped either, and thought that this was perhaps the most important thing she had ever taught him. "No," he said, "it does not." On a bright October morning in 1888, Arthur stood on the porch of the ranch house in the early light, drinking coffee and watching the eastern land where the sun was coming up over the mesa in long gold sheets, and listened to the sounds of the house behind him coming alive. James, who was 6 now and already learning to ride with a seriousness of purpose that suggested he had been planning it for years, was talking to someone, probably to Clara, who at 2 years old was already following her brother everywhere with the focused determination of someone who intends to do everything he does and do it better. He could hear Delia's voice from the kitchen, talking to Horace about the week's supply order, the measured and efficient voice that handled the 1,000 practical details of running this place with the same energy it brought to everything else. He had been here 6 years. He had ridden into this town following a letter from a friend, and had been warned about a woman who would fight him on every decision, and he had thought that sounded like someone worth listening to, and he had been right in a way that he could not have imagined from the back of a horse on the main street of Copper Creek in the spring of 1882. The land was beautiful in the morning light. The 120 acres his wife had defended with a deed in her pocket, and a rifle in the night had become 320, and would become more, and the creek ran clean along its proper banks, and the kitchen garden was going into its fall preparation with the new seedbeds that Delia and Rosa had designed together over the summer, and the cattle were moving in the north pasture in the way that healthy cattle move, unhurried and content. Delia came out onto the porch with her own coffee and stood beside him. "Beautiful morning," he said. "The best kind," she said. She was looking at the eastern mesa with the expression she wore when she was genuinely at peace, which was not an expression she wore for show or for courtesy, but only when she actually felt it. "I have been thinking," she said. He smiled into his coffee. "Tell me," he said. "About the school," she said. "Miss Harding is going to need an assistant next year. The enrollment has doubled and she cannot manage it alone. I have been thinking about approaching the county about funding a second teacher position." "You have already written the letter," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The first draft," she said. I wanted to discuss it with you before I finalize it." "That is very considerate," he said. "I thought so," she said. "What do you think about including the proposed enrollment projections from the Garcia family's extended relatives who are moving to the valley in the spring? If we can demonstrate the growth trajectory, then the county cannot argue the position is unnecessary," he said. "Yes, that is the right argument. I thought you would see it that way," she said. "I need the count from the Garcia side. Can you ask Roberto when you are in town Thursday?" "I will ask him Wednesday," he said. "So you have it in time to revise the letter before the end of the week." She looked at him. The morning light was full on her face, and she was 32 years old and had built something extraordinary out of land and determination, and an absolute refusal to be told what she could not do. And she was looking at him with the expression she saved for the moments when she let herself feel the full weight of what they had found in each other. "Thank you," she said. And she did not mean only the letter or only Roberto Garcia's address, and they both knew it. "Always," he said. James appeared in the doorway with his boots on and his hat somewhat askew, announcing that Horace had said the north fence needed checking and that he was going to help, a statement that Horace, appearing behind him, confirmed with the expression of a man who had been thoroughly managed by a 6-year-old. Delia looked at her son and then at Horace. "Take him," she said, "but he wears his coat." "I do not need my coat," James said. "The morning is cold," Delia said. "Coat." "But James Edward Hudson," Delia said, in the particular tone that contained an entire argument fully concluded. James got his coat. Horace caught Arthur's eye over the boy's head, and there passed between them the look of men who fully understood that some arguments were decided before they began. Clara appeared at Delia's knee, carrying a rag doll and expressing a firm intention to also go to the north fence, which Delia managed with the practiced diplomacy of someone who had been negotiating with strong-willed individuals for a great many years. The morning opened up around all of them, full and bright and ongoing, the work of the day beginning in the way it always began on the Abbott land, with purpose and with voices, and with the particular liveliness of a place where people have put their whole hearts into the ground and coaxed something real out of it. Arthur finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail and put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him. And in front of them, the New Mexico morning was going golden and enormous over the land they had fought for together. Every argument and every concession, and every letter to every land office, and every long evening at the kitchen table having brought them to exactly this moment, standing on the porch of a home that was real in the fullest sense of the word. In a life that was fully and freely chosen. "Ready for the day," he said. "Always," she said, and it was true. She was always ready, and so was he, and this was the most important thing they had ever agreed on. They went inside together, to the kitchen where the breakfast was waiting and the children were loud, and the work of the day was already beginning, to the life they had built argument by argument and decision by decision on the sun-warmed ground of the New Mexico territory, which had asked everything of them and given everything back. The years that came after were good ones, built on the solid foundation of everything they had already made. James grew into a serious and capable young man who had his mother's gift for the land and his father's patience, and who could work a cattle negotiation at 14 with a thoroughness that made grown men check their papers twice. Clara grew into a fierce and bright-eyed girl who read everything she could get her hands on and who had already told Miss Harding at the age of 7 that when she grew up she intended to be a lawyer, which Miss Harding reported to Delia with considerable delight. Delia had looked at Arthur when she heard this. "A lawyer," she said. "She has the right instincts for it," Arthur said. "She absolutely does," Delia said, and the pride in her voice was enormous and entirely unself-conscious. The kitchen garden operation had grown by 1890 into something that required its own bookkeeping, which Delia managed with the same precision she had always brought to the ranch accounts. She had begun teaching what she knew about high desert horticulture to 3 of the newer families in the valley. sharing the years of observation and adjustment that had made her garden the most productive in the territory. And these teaching sessions had become, without anyone formally organizing them, a regular gathering of the women from the surrounding properties who came to the Abbott land on the first Tuesday of every month to share knowledge and work, and the particular sustenance of each other's company. Arthur, on the occasions when he arrived home on a first Tuesday to find the ranch yard full of horses, and the kitchen loud with voices and laughter, always found a reason to stay outside for a while, because he understood that this was Delia's space in a particular way, and he did not want to crowd it, and because from the outside he could hear the sound of it, the community that his wife had built the same way she built everything. Through genuine knowledge freely shared and genuine respect for the people around her. He had been warned she would fight him on every decision. He had said that sounded like someone worth listening to. He thought about that sometimes, on the evenings when they sat on the south porch in the particular quiet that falls at the end of a well-worked day, the land going dark around them and the stars coming on overhead in their millions, the sounds of the children inside winding toward sleep, Delia beside him with her journal open or her accounts book, or simply her hands at rest in her lap, which was the rarest and most telling indication that she was truly content. He thought about the young man on the horse on the main street of Copper Creek who had heard a woman's voice certain and clear across the street, and turned to look. And he thought about everything that had followed from that turning, every argument and every concession, and every evening working at the kitchen table, and every morning standing at the fence line in the good light of this land they had made together. He thought that if he could go back to that moment knowing everything, he would turn in exactly the same direction. "You have that look," Delia said one evening without looking up from her journal. "What look?" he said. "The one where you are thinking about something and pleased about it," she said. "I am thinking about the day I arrived in Copper Creek," he said. She did look up then, and her eyes were the same dark color they had always been, creek water in shadow, and they were fully at home in her face in the way that people look when they have arrived at where they were always supposed to be. "What about it?" she said. "Just that it was a very good day," he said, "as days go." She held his gaze for a moment, and then the corners of her mouth did the complicated thing they had always done, the thing he had been reading for years and never got tired of reading. "Agree," she said. She went back to her journal. He went back to the stars. The land lay quiet around them in the New Mexico evening, 320 acres along the best creek in the Eastern Valley, belonging to them and to their children, and to the long future they were making together. One argued over, carefully considered, fully examined decision at a time. The Abbott land stood, and the people on it thrived, and the arguments never stopped, and neither did the love. And this was exactly how it was always going to be.